E adesso introdurriamo il nuovo speaker, la professoressa Beth, che a differenza delle persone che hanno preceduto la professoressa è una collega, è una nutrizionista di campo del Nord America, opera, è graduata alla Cornell University, tutti i PhD e tutto quant'altro serve per poter fare il suo lavoro ai massimi livelli, ma la contraddistingue il fatto che lei sempre ha lavorato nelle aziende. Quindi diamo un benvenuto a una collega di grande valore e quindi prego Beth.
I'd like to thank EDF Man for inviting me to come to Italy to visit with you today about nutrition and management for profitable cows. And I give you the perspective of a U.S. dairy nutrition consultant. I know that my world is different from your world, and my hope is that you can take something that I've learned primarily from American dairy producers and apply it to your world, which is slightly different than mine here in Italy. I also want to start off and make sure you're not confused, because I worry that someone out there says, she's from New York. There aren't any cows in New York. How can you have a dairy nutritionist from New York City? I'm not from New York City. I'm from New York State. And even people in America get confused about this. So don't feel like you're the only one. And New York State is shaped like a triangle. In the bottom, you have New York City. In the west, we have Niagara Falls. 6 hours between New York City and Niagara Falls. I live way up here in Plattsburgh, New York, which you've probably never heard of, and that's 6 hours from New York City and 6 hours from Niagara Falls. And if you didn't know it, there's about 630,000 lactating cows in New York State, and we're in the top 5 states in terms of milk production in the U.S. So the farms that I have in my area, of course, we have a lot of large free stalls in my area, and that's getting to be more and more true every day, it seems like. We have some farms with robot milkers. They may have been put in both new facilities or in old facilities. And we still have a few tie stall barns left in New York State, but they're unfortunately disappearing rather fast. As far as the ration ingredients that I typically have to work with, either if I'm working in the northeast of the U.S. or I often work up in Quebec, we've got corn silage, we've got alfalfa grass as our primary forage supply, we've got corn or maize as our primary starch source, but we also have a lot of wheat, especially wheat byproducts, such as bakery product or wheat midds or flour. We've got soybean meal as well as high bypass soybean. We've got canola meal, and we've got our corn byproducts as our protein sources. Our distillers, our corn gluten feed, and corn gluten meal would be in that category. As I understand it, unlike you, we do have animal proteins that we can use. They really help us out. We don't feed a lot of them, but they can help us out in meeting the amino acid needs of the very highest producing cows. So just a couple graphs here of what we're doing here, we're doing in the United States as far as milk production. In 2010, average milk production was about 9,600 kilos per cow per year. Now we're at about 11,000 kilos per cow per year. I would say that's all due to improvements in nutrition, but I have to say that, maybe the geneticist helped us out a bit in that increase. We've got better reproduction. There's been a lot of investment in cow comfort, and then we're doing better on transition cow management. The next slide I show is because I know someone out there in the audience, I know I've been to European enough to know, in the European countries, you all think that United States dairy farmers make water. Okay, we don't make water. We have components in our milk as well. And what is amazing to me is that it's actually been increasing. In 2010, 3.21% crude protein in the milk. 2024, we're up to 3.45% crude protein in our milk. What I get pretty excited about is the fat improvement that we've had just since 2010. 2010, an average of 3.66. 2024, we're up to 4.21% milk fat. So it's not water. We're doing actually very well. And at the same time, we've increased the forage content of our diets, at least in my area of the Northeastern United States. We've got higher forage diets, and those forages are higher in fiber digestibility. And I get really excited about that. I think that's been a great thing in terms of profitability on the farms that I work with. When I graduated from my PhD about 30 years ago, a typical diet was 50-50 forage to concentrate, and a typical high production diet. Now you see many high production diets on large dairies where they're feeding 60% forage. And I think a lot of that's due to the fact that they've really made an investment and really worked hard to get a higher fiber digestibility, especially in their forages. So we have this efficiency measure that I'm sure you're all familiar with, physical feed efficiency. And that's the kilos of energy-corrected milk per kilo of dry matter intake. And we have various goals for what we want in terms of physical feed efficiency. I think of physical feed efficiency as just basically an indication of how much that the cow eats, her diet, how much of it goes towards milk, and how much of it goes towards manure. And of course, we want more milk than manure. I use physical feed efficiency. I think it has some value, but I do have some concerns with this measure. I think it's a bit overused. And my biggest concern with physical feed efficiency is that it doesn't consider the price of that dry matter that the cow ate. And that becomes important, especially when I'm trying to increase the forages in the diet. The price of that dry matter varies. And here's my very simplistic example. We've got cow number 1, who's making 41 kilos of energy-corrected milk and eating 23 kilos of dry matter. Cow number 2, same amount of milk, but 25 kilos of dry matter. And somebody would say to me, oh, Mary Beth, I prefer this cow because she's got a higher feed efficiency. And I say, you better look at the ration, because the ration is very different. This ration here actually is fairly similar to what I might have fed to a high-producing cow 25 years ago. 30% NDF, 27% starch, feeding half a kilo of bypass fat and half a kilo of animal protein. Don't get my cost numbers, it may not be exact, but let's just say this cost is at $9 per cow per day. But look over here in this cow. This is more similar to the cows that we have today, eating 33% NDF, 24% starch, half as much bypass fat, half as much animal protein. Obviously, the cost of that ration is less. So which cow would you like to have in your barn? Which ration would you prefer to be feeding? I would prefer this ration here. Even though the number for feed efficiency is lower, I think you're going to make more money with this cow on this ration. So we're talking about improving profitability. We're talking about nutrition and management for improving profitability. And I would say goal number 1 is to make that rumen work for you. And I think sometimes we're guilty of forgetting the value of that rumen that we have inside of our cows. We tend to think we're pig farmers. I don't want to be a pig farmer. Pigs don't have that great rumen inside of them that can digest fiber and digest sugar and starch. I want to maximize that digestion of nutrients in our cow's rumen. I want to make as much microbial protein as I can inside that cow's rumen. And obviously, I also want to have improved or a great rumen health in the cows that I'm working with. And when I think of rumen health, I'm rather simplistic. I think of subclinical rumen acidosis. And in that situation, when we get a pH of less than 5.8, we're inhibiting the growth of the rumen bacteria, especially those bacteria that digest fiber. And of course, that's going to reduce the rates of fiber digestion, and it's going to reduce rumen microbial protein synthesis. I think a lot about hourly fluctuations in rumen pH. Do I have the actual numbers? Do I have pH meters in every cow? No. But I'm still thinking about those fluctuations in rumen pH. 20 years ago, on farms that I worked with in New York State, you would have seen a lot more laminitis and a true acidosis. you would have seen lower milk fats on those herds. A lot of people are like, hey, I'm done with acidosis. I've cured all those problems. I say, wait a minute. You may be making 42, 43 kilos of milk per cow per day, but I still say if I could figure out a way to reduce the number of hours where the pH in your cows is less than 5.8, I can still make more milk. I can still make more components. So even on good herds, I'm looking at the manure, I'm looking at cud chewing, I'm looking at the ration and seeing, can I make that cow just a bit more healthy in terms of hourly rumen pH? Can I reduce the number of hours per day that rumen is below 5.8 and make more milk and milk components? So we've got a little balancing act going on in our rumen between the fiber, which is helping to buffer the rumen, the starch, which is making acids. My diagrams are simpler than Greg's this morning, although I totally agree with everything Greg was saying. Mine are simplistic. But I wanted you to think in terms of a rumen balancing act going on each minute of the day, because that's what I think about. We want to make sure that rumen is as healthy as possible every minute of the day. And we'll start by talking a bit about fiber. We know our cows need physically effective NDF, and that NDF helps our cows a lot. It helps to stimulate chewing and saliva production to increase rumen pH. It helps us to form that rumen mat, which slows down passage of grains and increases their digestibility. And I will note, I used to have my arm inside of a cow quite often. Here you see my reminder, the fistulated cow. I used to spend a lot of time doing rumen diving on good university diets, okay? Lots of times those cows had very little rumen mat. We have to remember that it's not just a given that cows will have a great rumen mat. We have to focus on providing enough effective fiber to provide that mat. And like Greg was saying this morning, it's also very important that we provide that fiber to facilitate the movement of rumen contents and the absorption of acids. It's kind of like a washing machine in there. We want to get that movement of everything around so that the acids get to the outside, to the rumen papillae, to be absorbed. But then on the other hand, we're always doing that balancing act. We have to remember that NDF may hinder the cow. Rumen fill from NDF limits intake. What I mean is that high-producing cows that have a well-functioning rumen are going to be limited in forage intake by the bulkiness of the fiber which fills up the rumen. And that bulkiness, that mass, is going to be best estimated by the forage NDF content and by NDF digestibility. About the time I graduated from school, we used to say cows can eat 1.2% of their body weight as NDF. And we balanced rations accordingly. We said, oh, high-producing cows, she can only eat that much NDF. All the rest of her ration needs to come from something else. But we've learned with higher fiber digestibility that cows can actually eat about 1.8% or as high as 1.8% of their body weight if that NDF is very digestible. I think that 1.8% would be like on rotationally grazed pasture or well-managed rotationally grazed pasture. Very, very highly digestible. You'll see them eat that much in terms of NDF. In this study, we show how cows can eat more NDF when it's highly digestible. And they did this very simply by replacing starch with the highly digestible soy hulls. So you see here the normal starch diet with 3.6% soy hulls in it and 27% starch. The reduced starch diet had 12.7% soy hulls and 22% starch. And what they found first and foremost was with that normal starch diet, they ate exactly what we used to think cows would eat in terms of NDF. They ate 1.2% of their body weight. But with the reduced starch diet, where we were relying more on high digestibility fiber, those cows ate 1.52% of their body weight as NDF. And if you look down here, you see that milk fat increased with this study with the extra fiber. I don't like that 3.08. Of course, we would never want that on any of our farms, nor do we really like the 3.33. But it did improve milk fat. Fat-corrected milk was also increased. And in terms of physical feed efficiency, we lowered physical feed efficiency with this ration from 1.77 to 1.7. I personally would prefer, in this case, the reduced starch diet with higher butter fat and higher milk production and probably a healthier rumen in spite of the reduction in physical feed efficiency. So because of this work showing that fiber digestibility can help us in terms of intake and production on our farms, a lot of the producers that I work with in the Northeast have really emphasized trying to improve fiber digestibility on their dairies. The first way they've done it is by improved forage management. They're cutting that grass more frequently, more like every 4 to 5 weeks, rather than maybe in the past it was more like 6 to 7 weeks. They're shortening those cutting intervals on their farms with the goal of getting over 55% NDF digestibility at 30 hours with their grasses and over 50% NDF digestibility at 30 hours with their alfalfa. They've also turned to better forage genetics. We've used a lot of the brown midrip corn in the Northeast in the last 20 years. You're probably familiar with that corn, which has a natural gene mutation and has lower lignin content. Very importantly, 2% lignin versus 3% lignin in this corn, a higher fiber digestibility, and a higher NEL. So that's what a lot of the producers that I've worked with have done. I think there's also opportunity to use the lower lignin alfalfa, which we now have, as well as the BMR sorghum, which is available. I have not used that much, but I think those are great options. If those aren't options for you or for others, maybe feeding higher amounts of highly digested non-forage fibers, such as beet pulp or soy hulls, like in that example we just had, can really help us to improve overall average fiber digestibility in the rations that we're working with. And I would say in my world, I see rations from our state of Florida, which is, warm and humid. They have a tough time making good forages. They would incorporate many different byproducts in order to improve overall fiber digestibility in their rations. So you figured that out, I love highly digestible forages and just fiber in general. When I get that, I'm going to get more energy from my fiber. I'm going to get a higher NDF intake. Both of those things should help me get more milk from my cows, and at the same time, I can provide less energy from grain and fats and save money on the diet. So diet cost is lower, I get a higher income over feed cost. I should have less subclinical rumen acidosis because I have more fiber and I'm relying less on starches in the diet. I should also get more milk fat. But I want to emphasize that sometimes if we're not paying attention and doing everything we should, we don't get those improvements like we expect. The reason is that if we have diets with higher fiber digestibility, if we do not maintain or improve rumen function, our production responses may be compromised. And that was a big learning experience that I had with these more highly digestible forages. What happened was my farmers would say, "Hey, Mary Beth, I've got this great new BMR corn. I want to open that silo in 3 weeks. I don't want to change anything in the ration. I want to leave the ration exactly the same, and I just want to go from conventional corn silage to BMR corn silage because the guy who sold me that BMR seed said I would make more milk." And of course, being the good nutritionist, I said, "Sure, Mr. Farmer, you do whatever you want," right? So that's what happened. And this study, which was done at the Minor Institute, shows exactly what happened on many of my, or not, I shouldn't say many, the few that started with this, on my customers' farms. They simply replaced the conventional corn silage with the BMR corn. In this case, they were feeding corn silage at 43% of the dry matter. And what they found was that dry matter intake increased, NDF intake increased, milk increased slightly, but not significantly, from 41 to 42. Fat increased slightly, but feed efficiency dropped from 1.6 to 1.5. And I wasn't happy with these numbers either. It was not the kind of production response that I was expecting from BMR corn. So what we learned was that with no other ration adjustments, if we just made that swap in corn silage, if we didn't put any extra NDF or straw in that diet, there was actually less chewing and possibly a higher rate of passage in our diets with that BMR corn. As you can see here, the eating minutes per kilo of NDF was lower with the BMR corn, and the ruminating minutes per kilo of NDF was also lower. And this is what got us into trouble. We wanted that highly digestible fiber. We knew there was more energy. We knew the cows would eat more, but we didn't pay attention to something that's very important: undigested NDF, or I should say we learned about undigested NDF with BMR corn. Undigested NDF is that NDF which after 240 hours in a flask with rumen bacteria is left. I think of it as that lignified, very woody fiber that's in my wood pile for the wood that I want to heat my house with. That's that wood that's going to just sit in that rumen forever, right? The thing is, especially with our highly digestible NDF, we can think of the highly digestible NDF as the gas, which is going to help us make more milk in our cows, right? We're like, yay, let's go with the digestible NDF. Let's make a lot of milk. Let's see those cows eat a lot. But we can't forget that we need to put the brakes on the system. The undigested NDF is the brakes on our cow's system. And we need a little bit of that stuff in our cow's rumen, in our cow's diet, to control acidosis. And so that's what we learned about when we started using the BMR corn. So this undigested NDF helps us to predict NDF digestibility and energy value. It helps us to predict dry matter intake. And very importantly, it helps us to predict the acidosis potential and rumen passage rate of feeds. Rick Grant from the Minor Institute would say that a value of 7, you've got to be maybe a little bit concerned that you might get into some issues with subclinical rumen acidosis. 8 to 9.5 seems to be a good range. 10 worries about your limiting rumen fill. You've got too much of that woody fiber in there, and the cow just can't eat enough of it. Finally, we need to think about 3 things which will affect chewing time and rumen pH. We talked about NDF digestibility. We talked about UNDF. We also need to think about particle size. And just to be complicated, they all interact together. We need that adequate physically effective NDF, and we need that UNDF. But if we have excessively long particles, especially particles with high UNDF, we're going to have a problem with too much eating time. It takes too long for that cow to chew those long particles, which are high in especially those that are high in UNDF. If it takes her too long to eat, it's going to result in lower intake and lower milk. Because of some of this research that was done, and I'm not going into the whole study that they did at the Minor Institute, what farmers are actually doing is, when the weather is bad and they can't get out to chop their grass on time, that happens in New York State. I don't know if that happens in Italy or not, but that happens in New York State. If the weather's bad and they can't get out and chop, they're actually, once they do get on the field and when they chop the hay, they're chopping it shorter, because they know it's going to be higher in UNDF. So they're trying to get a jump on it and say that stuff needs to be chopped a little bit more by the chopper so that I can ensure that the cows won't back off as much on intake and milk production when I'm feeding it. We're also watching out for excessively long particles in the TMR because they can cause more sorting. So there's some new particle size recommendations. You're familiar with the Penn State particle size separator. It used to be, I always said I wanted about 10% on the top screen. Now they're kind of saying we need to bring that back a little bit, because if we get over 10%, we're probably going to cut into that cow's eating time, and it's also going to be more sortable for the cows. We do still have to pay very close attention to especially what's going on the second screen, but also the third screen as well, because that's still physically effective fiber. We've got to provide enough physically effective fiber, but we don't want that stuff that's going to be more sortable, and we don't want the cow to have too much chewing time. So cow comfort and feeding management for better rumen health. I put the cow's nose on here because in my mind, cow comfort and feeding management are affecting how much that cow eats and when she eats, also affecting when that cow is going to chew her cud. And as nutritionists, we have to think about what's going on there because that's going to affect our rations. Something to ruminate on. Again, this was some work from Dr. Rick Grant at the Minor Institute. We do some bad things on our dairies. Maybe not your dairies here in Italy, but in New York, sometimes we do some bad things, right? We put our primiparous cows in with mature cows. That's going to reduce rumination. We overcrowd cows. That's going to reduce rumination. We might have them in the headlocks too long. We might have uncomfortable resting surfaces. We might have heat stress. All those things are going to reduce rumination in our cows, no matter what the ration is in terms of physically effective NDF. I really like this quote, that heifers, primiparous cows, that lie down in a stall that they know is preferred by an older cow will ruminate 40% less. It's like, wow, how could that possibly be? But I think of that little cow in her stall kind of looking back and forth saying, oh, crud, big boss cow's coming and she's going to make me get out of here. And she doesn't ruminate as much. It's a true story. That's true research that they say that. But for me, from the nutritionist perspective, if I've got these kind of things going on in the herd that I'm working with, I've got to put more protection into my system. I've got to add even a little bit more UNDF. I got to really make sure I got physically effective NDF in that ration at the level that it needs to be, because I know that I've got a compromised situation going on the dairy that I'm working with. So what are the ideal levels of fiber in the high cow diet? I always say it always depends. Many of you are out on farms, and you might have the same situation I have. You're trying to get this new customer, and he says to you, just put together your best ration, the one that you think that always works and works great in every other farm that you have. And I don't like that when I'm presented with that demand, because it really does depend. I would like to know what he's feeding today. I would like to look at his cows and see how well they're chewing. I would like to see the management, and I would also like to look at the manure, because that's going to affect how I balance that proposed ration for that farm. Kind of some ranges that I work with, 28 to 36% NDF, 22 to 26% forage NDF. If that forage is not very digestible, I'm going to be down at the low end of that scale. If I've got very digestible forage, I'll be at the high end of that scale. So we'll switch gears now that we've finished talking about fiber and talk a little bit about starch, which would be our major acid producer in our cow's ration. Starch fermentation should be not too slow, but not too fast. Too slow, obviously, will be inadequate digestion, will probably reduce microbial protein synthesis. Too fast, we'll probably have more hours of the day where rumen pH is low. Starch fermentation is going to ferment differently depending on where it comes from, its source, and how we process it. Wheat and barley are going to be fermented more quickly than corn and sorghum. Steam flaked or high moisture corn is going to be fermented more quickly than your dry corn, especially your dry corn that's not ground effectively. Too much of that fast fermenting starch is going to yield more rumen acidity. This just shows a study which is done where they fed corn versus barley in a TMR. And you can see here we've got more hours of the day where pH is lower with the barley diet than with the corn diet. So now let's finally talk about optimizing rumen function in terms of making more microbial protein. There are microbial protein differences in our high-producing cows. And I know that because as I go down the road, I see farms that, jeepers, they're doing a great job on everything, and they actually don't even need a lot of really fancy stuff added to their diet in terms of amino acids. These cows just milk. And I say, you know, I think it could be a difference in the rumen microbial protein synthesis. And I've looked in the literature, and it can vary from 1.5 to 2.5 kilos per cow per day. I think that's a rather large range in microbial protein yield, especially when I think, that kilo of microbial protein is worth a lot. In my world, it's worth the current price of fish or blood meal, which is pretty expensive, and what I feed for that very, very top animal. So I want to make more microbial protein if I can. Some discussion on how microbial protein is made. My simplistic diagram here. You've got protein being converted to peptides and to amino acids. Outside of the bacteria, these are broken down into amino acids. Then the amino acids come into that bacteria cell. Grain, as well as forages, are broken down into sugars. Sugars then come into the microbial cell. If the amino acids are available at the same time as sugars are available in that rumen, the bacteria can make microbial protein. If the amino acids are available without a source of sugar, that amino acid is going to be converted into ammonia. Some of that ammonia is recycled back into the rumen. Some of that ammonia is going to end up as milk urea nitrogen in the milk that the cow produces. Sugar is the same thing. The amino acids have to be available at the same time as the sugars are available inside that bacteria cell in order to make microbial protein. If they're not, more VFA will be produced. Obviously, we want the VFA as an energy source, but we very much want the microbial protein. And I remind people that those rumen microbes are growing and reproducing on a minute-by-minute basis. And so we don't want those bacteria to have their steak at 6 o'clock in the morning and have their potatoes at noon. It doesn't matter to us, right? We're just people not reproducing constantly like the rumen microbes. It doesn't matter to us if we have our protein at 6 a.m. and our starch at noon. But the microbes want the ideal ratio 24 hours per day. So I think a lot about blending sugars and starches in order to give those bacteria a synchronized nutrient supply in the rumen. That balance, again, of protein and energy every minute of the day. I want that ideal ratio of protein and energy every minute of the day. Way back when I was in grad school, part of my PhD work was to come up with a model where I could predict the amount of protein, NDF, non-fiber carbohydrate, and NPN, nitrogen, available each hour of the day in the cow's rumen. So I spent a lot of time coming up with some different starch fractions and predicting when that cow would eat. The numbers here are not important. The concept is what is important. My model was not perfect, but I believe the concept is. Here we have the TMR fed twice a day, and that cow is eating a big meal after the TMR was offered, and then progressively smaller meals. So here in the green is the NFC, which was available on an hourly basis. The red is the true protein, the purple, the NDF, and the NPN spiking up. Those spikes aren't quite as severe as my graph shows, we know that. But what I want to show you is that if we're trying to achieve an ideal ratio of NSC to degradable protein, and this was one suggested ratio that we wanted, if we're trying to achieve that for our rumen microbes, you can tell that we don't have that same ratio 24 hours a day. And so my objective was to be able to predict what the ratio was and then be able to better predict rumen microbial synthesis on an hourly basis in the rumen. I was also trying to predict rumen pH on an hourly basis. This was 30 years ago. Mary Beth wasn't necessarily the best mathematician and computer person. I got the model, I got the concept, I knew it was right. They gave me the PhD, but I didn't patent it as something that I can use on dairies today. It wasn't that good. But I still think about it when I'm on farms, and I use it when I'm developing rations. And this is kind of my simplistic version. You've got cornmeal, which is going to be fermented, a bit slow. Our soybean meal, also a bit slow. So we want to blend, we want to have the soy and the cornmeal together in the ration for those rumen microbes. Your high moisture corn or your flake corn or your flour or your wheat is going to be fermented more quickly. something like canola ferments a little bit more quickly to go with those. It gets a little bit more complicated than this. I've actually developed fast starch and slow starch pools, things like that. But basically what you want is that blend, okay? You don't want all one or all the other. You want that blend. And when I worked in the feed industry full-time after graduating, at least in my world, the feed industry does have access to a lot of these more quickly available starch sources and have really learned to use them well. We have to be careful. We want them from the microbes. We can't use too much of it because it'll increase rumen acidity, but it can really help us to have the blend of these. Later, I don't know, a while after I graduated and was in the industry, I thought more about sugars and how sugars ferment rather quickly and how they can help those bacteria to use the non-protein nitrogen in the ration, either coming from urea or maybe coming from your alfalfa silage. So we want to have some sugars in the ration to go with those rapidly available proteins in the diet or nitrogen. So this is a study that was done at Wisconsin where they reduced the amount of starch in the diet and replaced the starch with sucrose. So we have 0, 2.5, 5% sucrose up to 7% sucrose. And what I really like about this study is that, 20 years ago, I might have said, so long as I have some really fine wheat in the diet for rapidly digestible starch to take care of the rumen microbes needs, I don't need to have sugars, right? I don't need that. I got my rapidly digestible wheat, I've got a little corn, I've got my mix, I don't need the sugar. In this study, the starch that they fed was very, very finely ground cornstarch. In my world, I keep a little box in my kitchen if I want to make gravy or if I want to make chocolate pudding. I use that very, very fine cornstarch. And that's about as rapidly digestible of a starch as you can get. That's what they were replacing in this example. And what I find interesting here is at our higher levels of sucrose, as we replaced starch, our urine nitrogen was reduced and our rumen ammonia was significantly reduced with the higher levels of sucrose. I would love to have an extra line on here telling us what the microbial protein yield was. I don't have that line. It's very expensive and difficult to measure microbial protein, but my guess is that that nitrogen, which would have otherwise been in the urine or ammonia, was converted into microbial protein in this experiment. This is an old study where they supplemented either 1.5 or 2 pounds of sugar to the cows. And I like this study because this is what I do on farms, and they got about the same results. They got about 1.5 kilos of milk when they supplemented 1.5 to 2 pounds of sugar supplement in this study. And what I like about it is these cows were already making a lot of milk. They were making 41 kilos of milk, and yet they still responded to sugar supplementation. I also like the fact that they got a very quick response in milk production when they added sugars. Within the first week, those cows bumped up in milk. And I don't know this for sure, but to my simple way of thinking, I think that's probably a protein response. Just like the protein response you might get when you put cows on fresh pasture in the spring. They bump right up in milk really quick. Usually we think that's a protein response. I would guess we got a little bit more microbial protein here, and that's what bumped those cows up so fast. Many positive effects of sugars that we know. It's going to improve the nitrogen utilization, increase microbial protein synthesis, helps us to increase rumen pH, increase butyrate concentrations, increase fiber digestion, as well as increase milk protein, and milk fat. And this is just some work I did with what we call a multiple study analysis. Again, similar results to that study I showed you, similar to what I often get on dairies. We got about a 1.5 kilo response when we supplemented 5 to 7% sugars on all cows, but in those higher producers, we got a greater response. So we want a model of this, right? We want to have our computer model say, hey, this is what you're doing, this is what the cows are going to make. We want that perfect system to predict what's going to happen on our farms that we're working with. We've got this Cornell net carbohydrate protein system, which has been commercialized as either NDS or AMTS. I'm sure many of you use these models. I use them. I think they've really helped us out in the last 20 years to feed cows better. I think we would all agree about that. But we have to remember that these models are what we call steady state models. They predict the nutrients that are going to be fermented in that cow each day. And maybe it's just because that's what I started on 30 years ago, but I don't think so. I think I see this every single day when I'm in the field. This is an issue. I didn't say I had it all solved, that I'm the great computer program, but we need to understand that we need to think about not what's going on each day, but what's going on each hour in that rumen. These models are going to assume a constant NFC to peptide ratio and assume a constant pH, although I do know that NDS has a submodel for predicting hourly pH, but I don't think that is affecting the full digestion and the full microbial protein yield. And I don't hold it against the model for not doing all this. As I say, I couldn't figure it out. But I do say we need to make sure we're smart about things. Remember that the computer models are helpful, but we need to provide accurate information into our models, especially for the analysis of fiber and starch, which means including UNDF and NDF digestibility and starch digestibility into that computer, not making up the numbers, as I know some good nutritionists do, at least in the United States. Then when we get the output from those models, we need to think. We need to use our brain, understanding that the models can always be improved, understanding that we can never just turn on the computer and turn off our brain and our eyes. The good thing is it's job security, right? They're always going to need us in the field. So that's my goal number one. Remember goal number one? Make the most of the rumen. Goal number two, if I want to be a profitable dairy farmer going ahead in the next 10 or 20 years, I want to make sure cows have no excuse, that they eat well and they milk. I explain to friends that don't know anything about cows that our dairy cows are high-performance race cars. I got to get them going. I had a guy ask me the other day, has dairy nutrition for cows changed in the last 100 years? I'm like, yes, of course. We have to feed our high-performance race cars. We need to give our cows oil for the best metabolic and liver function. We need to have an attentive dairy producer as the driver. We need to have good feet and legs, provide a great fuel in the diet, and provide a great engine in terms of the large and healthy rumen. And we have to have the keys there to make sure that cow is ready to go. I believe there's no excuses for having first calf heifer Holsteins that are 600 kilos in body weight at 22 months. And I think sometimes we're still not seeing the achievement of those goals. I want to be able to say that that cow can come in the herd, she can eat, she can milk, and she can milk over 45 kilos per cow per day. And I think we do know how to grow these heifers, and the good dairymen are doing a great job. We need to get everybody to do a great job. We know that if we provide the amino acids from milk that the calf needs, we can see greater gains during the calf period. But I think often we don't realize that that young heifer, 90 to 100 kilos, still has a small rumen. And so I believe we need to pay attention to amino acid nutrition in terms of the bypass proteins with that heifer. The bred heifer, older animal, we can still make a lot of rumen microbial protein. It's not necessary to provide those as much of the bypass amino acids. We need to get cows started right. This is a picture from the Minor Institute. I love this place at the Minor Institute, their pre-fresh pen. It always looks like this, beautiful. Cows are comfortable, cows are eating well, cows are eating a great diet, and they expect cows to make 100 pounds by 10 days in milk. They must be doing something right in the pre-fresh diet as well as in the transition after that in order to achieve 100 pounds at 10 days in milk. And that's what we need to be striving for on our dairies. We also need to be passionate about getting cows bred. This cow here is fat. She's fat, she's sitting around, she's not doing anything, and when she calves in her next lactation, you're going to have problems with her. We need to attain these kind of goals in terms of pregnancy rate, days in milk, and days dry. We need to be investing in cow comfort. And we need to be thinking in terms of profitability, profitability being in this example, the water in this barrel. If we want to improve profitability, we need to think about what the lowest stave of the barrel is on our farm. Is it rumen health? Is it fiber digestion? Is it transition cows? And we need to raise that stave of the barrel in order to improve profitability on our farm. Do I have time for my last example?
Yes.
It's the best one. So a few years ago, I was going to Wisconsin with a group of consultants that I work with. They're consultants from Quebec. In Quebec, they've got beautiful farms, shiny tractors. They make lots of milk with lots of money with their quota system. And they said, Mary Beth, we want to go to Wisconsin and we want to tour farms. They always want to come to the U.S. and tour farms. We live in New York, they're in Quebec. They want to go to Wisconsin out here, the dairy state. And they said, Mary Beth, where can we go? I said, I don't know anyone in Wisconsin. And then I remembered, I did have a friend in Wisconsin who had a dairy farm from college days. And so I arranged to go to his farm. Without asking him, some other friends got the bus to go to his farm. We jumped off the bus, me and my French-speaking Canadians, and surprised my friend at his farm. The very important thing to remember about my friend is he was a friend from grad school, and he was wicked smart. He was really a smart guy. He had his PhD in dairy nutrition, and he decided to be a dairy producer. Smart guy. 500 lactating cows, fed BMR corn silage, alfalfa, regular corn silage, 60% forage diet, excellent cow comfort, excellent forage quality. When I was there making 44.5 kilos of milk, I looked him up, he's making 45 now. Excellent dairy producer. I took my Canadian friends around the barn, right? We went to the high cow group, and this isn't the best picture, I stole it off the internet. These are his high cows. Not a fancy barn, but he's got the fans, he's got the high walls. He actually doesn't believe in headlocks because he wants more access to the bunk for his cows. He does a great job, okay? We went all the way around. We looked at the dry cows, we looked at the heifers, we looked at the feed bunks, and my friends from Quebec were like, oh, you're so smart, you're so wonderful, you're doing a great job, making lots of milk. So I forgot to mention, the Canadians are rich compared to the US farmers. I say that for my Canadian friends. They're rich, right? What do you think my Canadian friends that I took to Wisconsin wanted to see after I showed them all the cows and everything else? They want to see the parlor, right? Because parlors are so cool, and someone who makes lots of milk should have a big, beautiful new parlor, right? This was my friend's parlor. He puts 500 cows through a step-up parlor 3 times a day, which is crazy. And you should have seen my Canadian friends. They're like, no, that can't possibly be. How in the world could this guy milk his cows there? But my friend figured out the lowest stave of the barrel on his farm was not the milking parlor. It was focusing on things that make that cow make milk. Thank you very much.
So, Mary Beth. Forse sarebbe stato bello se i tuoi amici canadesi avessero regalato 2 robot a quel ragazzo. Allora, c'è una domanda, una domanda che è venuta. La leggo in inglese perché è più facile e verranno tradotte anche per voi in italiano. When we can produce high quality forages, do you think adding straw is a good strategy to UNDF? If so, what proportion and how chopped it should be? You cannot hear it? C'ho il microfono spento, credo. È acceso, però parlo in italiano. Ok. Questa domanda è stata fatta in inglese, quindi per non cercare di non tradurla male, l'ho letta in inglese e chiede: se noi abbiamo la possibilità di produrre un gran foraggio, di grande digeribilità e quant'altro, come abbiamo visto dalla sua slides, c'è un po', no? C'è il famoso bilanciamento tra la UNDF e la Very Digestible NDF, pensi che sia adeguato dare un piccolo quantitativo di paglia e se è così a quale proporzione e in quale dimensione, quanto trinciata?
Yes, I appreciate. Were you okay? I appreciate that question. I should have mentioned that's one thing we did when we started feeding BMR corn is bringing in some straw. And some people are like, that sounds crazy. Why would you bring the straw in and reduce digestibility? It actually seems to be better to meet those UNDF requirements with a little bit of, could be straw, but meet those UNDF requirements and then have the rest as digestible fiber rather than the average. It's not about the average digestibility. It's about having enough of that woody fiber to maintain rumen health, and then having the highly digestible fiber. And I would cut it not too long, and I would also make sure that the cows are not sorting the ration.
Thank you, Mary Beth. Salutiamo la professoressa, nostra collega.